Okay, thanks everyone for coming to this session of 8th week of the jurisprudence discussion group in this nice but different room from our usual venue. We have with us today Professor Teresa Marques. She's associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Barcelona, and she's also part of the Logos research group there, and also the Barcelona Institute of Analytic Philosophy. And she's going to present today the paper, The Expression of Anger. It's very interesting. So Teresa will present the paper for around 30 to 40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up to the usual Q&A. Thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm delighted to come here. The paper has had different titles. It's been, the draft, let's be more precise. It's been the expression of anger, the public expression of anger, the contexts for the expression of anger, the apt context for the expression of anger, or the aptness of the expression of anger. So there's been a variety of those, but it's roughly along those lines. So this morning I took a small tour here in Oxford. I surprisingly, for some reason, I'd never been. So, and my family's here with me, so we took a small tour, and I learned this story that I thought might be an interesting way to start. So apparently there's a story that I'm sure all of you know, but I didn't, so I just learned it, about the Saint Scholastica riots somewhere in the Middle Ages. Students went to a pub, they said that the wine wasn't good, what's the name of the person of the pub, the publican, the owner of the pub, was very angry, so called his mates, and it's a big fight and riots, and apparently some student died, and then for a long time on the anniversary of that riot, there'll be more riots and more students would die. So I thought, oh, this is a nice illustration of what expressing anger publicly might get you, and why traditionally in the history of philosophy people have argued against its expression, its public expression, and perhaps even having or feeling angry as something that is counterproductive, to say the least for those of you students in the story that I learned about this morning. But the standard or traditional view about anger has been disputed in recent years by philosophers, mainly philosophers from a range of areas, from people who work on epistemology, but also in political philosophy, and perhaps even in legal philosophy, and in the philosophy of emotions, who think that we have not properly appreciated the fact that emotions might be apt or might be the right way to feel under certain conditions, right? So under certain conditions, we might have the good kind of reasons to be angry. And in the cases in which those conditions include injustices or moral wrongs, then in those cases it's the right thing to feel angry. Right? So this is the background or the setup of the discussion. And although I will agree that yes, emotions have, I will defer to people who work on the psychology and philosophy of emotions who argue that emotions have aptness conditions, and I'll explain that in a moment. But I do disagree with some of the arguments that are provided in defense of the public expression of anger, because I think that in general those arguments mistakenly assume that the aptness of anger includes moral wrongs, and I think we have no reason to think that that's the case. So we'll get there and then see how the arguments go. So, anger, for or against. So there have been the classic arguments, and I'll try not to take too long in presenting them. The classical arguments go back, as I said, to Aristotle or the Stoics, and they're basically of two kinds. On the one hand, there are arguments that focus on prudential reasons against anger or being angry. Seneca presumably considers that when one is moved by anger, one fails to be moved by reasons or does not take reasons to deliberate into account. One is somehow in a mad-like state, and so because one is ungoverned by reason, one cannot be led by anger when acting in public. So this has been one of the main considerations, right? Then, of course, one will be acting in ways that are counterproductive to whatever aims one might have. There are also moral considerations. Someone who has developed the classic kind of arguments against anger has been Martha Nussbaum. So she's argued that anger is counterproductive, but also morally problematic. Right? So the two kind of arguments against anger. Right? How? Well, one tends to alienate would-be allies, one might aggravate conflict, and ultimately undermine the pursuit of just outcomes. It's also morally problematic because this is already entering what the emotion or the attitude might be, because the idea is that it involves essentially as what it is, something like a desire for payback or a desire to harm the others who have wronged you, presumably. So, but this idea of payback or retribution is itself normatively or morally problematic. It involves the idea of injuring the others. So, those are some of the standard arguments, and in fact they are arguments that have been more or less recognized, in particular the idea that anger involves, as part of what it is, its nature, involves a certain kind of motivational force, and so part of what it is, it involves motivating people to retribute or to respond aggressively or to retaliate in some way. And so there are diverse psychologists and philosophers of emotion in the last perhaps 20 years or so have said things like it involves the urge to attack as something that is essential to it. So that's sort of the setback, right? Let me just emphasize also that someone who has written from the perspective of philosophy of mind on anger, Laura Silva, that's her name. She has actually done a nice work of reviewing some of the historical work that exists on anger. And in fact, it goes not just from philosophy and political theory, but also in religion, from Christian thought to Buddhist thought. People have said that we should not act moved by anger, that these feelings are negative and bad in some way. Okay, so that's the background. So what about the defense of anger? Right. This is, as I started by saying in the beginning, something that is relatively recent. And so to understand the kind of defense that is given, I'll give you a little bit of an explanation of what people mean when they talk of emotions as appraisal states. Right? So this is where the idea of aptness comes from. So the idea of an emotion as an appraisal state starts by considering what an emotion is, or what an affective state is, or a state that is not like a belief and not like perception. It's a different kind of mental state. So what is an emotion? So on the one hand, emotions are mental states that are intentional. They are intentional in the sense that they have an intentional object. So if a child is afraid of spiders, spiders are the intentional object of the emotion of fear. Okay. Now, the child could be afraid of, say, black pens. Right? The object or intentional object here in this case would be different, would be black pens instead of a spider, or spiders in general, but the emotion itself would be the same. So what is it that is the same in the two cases, although the content differs? So one way that has become standard as a way of characterizing emotions is to characterize what is some people call the emotional syndrome. So different kinds of aspects that all emotions presumably have as intrinsic to that make them what they are, besides the intentional objects they might have. So one of them is what is it that they do? What is it that they are as an appraisal, let's say. So fear is a way of appraising something as dangerous or threatening. Right? So a child is afraid of, not as a cognitive belief, not as something that, oh, this is really something that is dangerous, therefore I will feel afraid. That's not how fear reacts. So people might feel fear instinctively, without having thought or even having the conceptual capacity for thinking that certain things are dangerous. So it's a response to things that are dangerous. And that's where the notion of aptness comes from. So it might be apt to feel fear, to be afraid of, say, one of these really poisonous Australian spiders. They're really dangerous, you should be afraid of those. And it might be very silly to be afraid of a black cat, right? Or of something that's completely safe, something fluffy. Right? So the emotion of fear is apt or fitting for things that are actually dangerous. It doesn't mean that you won't be afraid of things that are not dangerous, as many of us might be. But that's one way of making it vivid what the characteristic is. Then these appraisals are things that are very basic in our cognitive lives, and they come with additional things. They come with motivations, typical motivation tendencies, action tendencies, and particular kinds of desires or motivational aims. So people tend to, the idea is that fear typically motivates people to avoid what it is that they are appraising as dangerous or a threat, right? And there's a desire to avoid those kinds of things. So this is the background. So the same thing is said, something similar in terms of structure is said about anger. Right? So anger is a kind of appraisal of something that's perceived as fill in the blanks, right? We have to fill in the blanks, and now different people will gonna tell us different things. So people will say things like things that are an offense to me or mine, something that is perceived as a wrong, something that is perceived as injurious. Then it would come with a certain kinds of action tendencies. Presumably those action tendencies will include a tendency to retribute in some way for what one is perceived as a wrong. And in recent years, more or less, relatively recently, Andy and Srinivasan has argued that there's, for the aptness of anger, when it is a response to moral wrongs or injustice. Okay, so indeed she argues against Nussbaum. The argument, I think I try to summarize it in sort of a neat way for a talk. So one of Nussbaum's argument is the counterproductivity or prudential argument against anger or feeling angry in the public or political domain. But Srinivasan considers that these reasons of prudence, counterproductivity considerations are reasons of prudence or reasons of aptness, can come apart. Right? So it might be fitting to feel angry because someone has wronged you, even though it might be counterproductive to express your anger or to let others show that you are angry. So that much should be evident, I guess. Right? Then she adds that there are no good arguments on offer. That's to be decided in favor of counterproductivity considerations against aptness considerations. Therefore, if anger is apt, it can, or it does, that is unclear form of paper, trump prudential reasons against the place of anger in public life. Okay, so that's a neat argument, right? So Nussbaum says that there are counterproductivity concerns, so we shouldn't express it. Srinivasan argues, well, sure, there might be prudential reasons, but there are also aptness. It might be reasons that it is the fitting attitude to have in response to injustice, and without better reasons to think that prudential reasons should trump intrinsic reasons of value or of appraisal, then we shouldn't decide on the basis of counterproductivity considerations alone. In fact, she makes two important claims that rely on one assumption, I think, that are crucial claims, I think, that rely on one fundamental assumption that I think other people also rely on. So on the one hand, you have one consideration about anger being an effective evaluation of injustice. So I'll quote from her. She says, getting angry is a means of effectively registering or appreciating the injustice in the world. There might well be a value to appreciating the injustice of the world through one's apt anger. Okay? And then there's another consideration that she makes, which is important, which concerns one of the ways in which we use anger, for what we use it for. And she considers that it serves to communicate this evaluation. So when I'm angry, I'm communicating my negative evaluation of something as unjust. And so it might serve an important role in public life to be able to express one's anger. And again, I quote from her, she says, "To get aptly angry is not merely to appreciate the disvalue of an unjust situation or an immoral act. Anger is also a form of communication, a way of publicly marking moral disvalue, calling for the shared negative appreciation of others." Okay. I said that there's a fundamental assumption in both cases. So in both cases, both as an appreciation or evaluation of anger in the world that is distinct from merely knowing that certain facts occur, and as a way of communicating or for calling for the shared negative appreciation of others, both of these things require, both of these factors, let's say, if they are characteristics of anger, require that a certain assumption is correct. In particular, that the assumption that anger's fitness includes that anger is the apt attitude to have as a reaction or when elicited by injustice or moral wrongs. So that's the fundamental assumption, and that's one of the main points that I want to discuss. Before moving on, let me check my time. Do you know how I'm doing the time? I used 10 minutes, right?
10 to 15.
Okay. So I won't take too long in repeating, but other people have made similar arguments, in particular about the role of anger in the communication of anger. So Maxime Lepoutre has said that communicating anger to one's listeners plays an indispensable role in directing their attention to elusive, morally relevant features of situations in the world. David Shoemaker and Laura Silva, as I said, they also say that there's a communicative dimension that is essential to the nature of anger. I won't have time to go over all of those, but I'll point out that Shoemaker makes one distinction that is interesting, namely that he admits that there are different kinds of anger, that not all anger is a response to moral wrongs. He says that there are, it's an emotion that we have and that other non-human animals also have. Other primates might also get angry. Human infants also get angry, and it's a little bit unlikely that they would get angry as a response to moral injustice or to moral wrongs in the world. It's more likely that they get angry at goal obstructions, like frustration of goals or frustration of aims. You don't get what you want, basically, or what interests you. Excuse me. Silva says something, but Laura Silva says something more robust as to what anger is. So if you remember, I said that emotions normally have what is the presumed appraisal state. So some people, or most people that in this literature who are defending anger, defend this assumption that I said Srinivasan makes about anger being an appraisal of injustice or of moral wrongs. And then there are issues about what are the action tendencies that it tends to bring out in people, and what are the desires and the motivations that people may have when they get angry, right? And if you recall, also some of the objections that Nussbaum raised concerned the kind of retributive inclinations that come when one is angry. So one who is angry might be inclined to retribute or to somehow correct or in some other way punish those who have angered him or her. And this desire is one that Laura Silva wants to question. She thinks it's not true that anger does this. She says that this is based on, well, the story. I don't have time to go into why she thinks that this has come about. I think she's not warranted there. But she goes over some work on empirical work and on psychology, like social psychologists, asking people the kind of things that they do when they're angry. And a lot of time people will say things like communicating, or trying to protest, or trying to write letters, or write petitions, or peacefully demonstrate, or a bunch of other things that don't involve acting in a way that is, say, violent or retributing in any way. So, what is the? I am not persuaded by this argument. It's one argument that I think is not particularly good. It'd be like saying that fear is not the emotion that tends to motivate people to avoid that which is dangerous, because it can't be that, because people do things that they are slightly afraid of all the time, like giving talks in public, or being recorded for a YouTube channel, or doing exams, or even bungee jumping, right? So people do a lot of things that they're afraid of. It doesn't mean that fear is not something that is an appraisal of danger, and that people might not be prima facie motivated to avoid things that they perceive as dangerous, right? The fact that people tend to do things that require them to face their own fears. Likewise, the fact that people seek other means to express their anger and act when they're motivated by anger that do not involve retribution, I think, does not show that anger does not constitutively involve retributive inclinations and desires. And in fact, I think that a lot of the arguments that are used here confuse what the emotion is with its intentional object. So remember the story of the child being afraid of the spider, right? So you might be, so sometimes people say, oh, I might be angry with a friend who is disloyal and I don't want to retribute in any way. I'll just tell her that I'm really upset. Sure. And this idea that people have these retributive inclinations is something that comes, I don't know, might have made sense in the Iliad or in ancient Greece when you have all these honor codes. But I mean, to properly appreciate this, we'd have to ask someone who, let's say, whose child was kidnapped and raped by your enemies, to a parent nowadays whose child might have been kidnapped and raped. How angry are they, and what desires do they have towards the presumed rapists or kidnapper? And I very much suspect that the emotion is not different, and that the desires of retribution are not distinct in those two cases. So you'd have to take the proportionality of the crime, let's say, and the proportionality with respect to the intensity of the emotion, to properly appraise whether or not there's a change in the kind of emotion that anger is across history, for instance. Right, so that's one of the objections that I have against this idea of revising the way we think about anger as somehow mistaken. So, to recall the in favor of anger and its expression, we have, on the one hand, people who are assuming that it's an apt emotion to have as a response to injustice or wrongs in the world. I've raised a little bit of a suspicion here, but not enough of a suspicion yet. And another concerns the kind of desires and kind of actions that being angry might motivate, where some people have argued that it's intrinsic to anger that one wants others to recognize that they have harmed us or wronged us, rather than wants to harm others in retribution, let's say, or to get them to pay back in some way. There are additional issues so I've already discussed part of the problems of expression, and I would like to get to the point of the assumption about why it's not wrong. There are aspects about communication. So there some of the points I want to make concerning communication. I might say a little bit more about the issues about communication. So acting in a way that communicates that one is upset and trying to draw attention to what one thinks is a wrong in some way or other has lower risks of suffering consequences of people who don't want to be accused of having wronged us than acting in other ways that are retributive directly. Right? So there's a rationale for seeking actions that require recognition or communication in ways that don't demand retribution in other ways. Some of them would be legal aspects, and others will have to do with just reasoning through the possible consequences of our behavior. And note that I've not shown that anger cannot have a communicative or recognitional goal. I think that is also an important aspect. What I don't think is that it has such a goal instead of a corrective or retributive one. So this is one of the criticisms that I want to make. There are other aspects about how we communicate that have to do with how we communicate emotions through action and through speech. So suppose, and that aspect puts in question the expectations that some of these theorists that I've mentioned, like Leput, for instance, and Srinivasan, they seem to place these expectations that by communicating the fact that we are angry about something that we think is an injustice, we are thereby sharing with others this negative appraisal. Right? This is a very simplified way of understanding how communication works, and in particular how the communication of emotions and feelings might be. So suppose that I yawn. Well, not now, but suppose that after dinner I yawn, right? And sort of look a bit tired. This action is somehow expressive of something that I feel. So by observing my action or my behavior, you now know that I am tired or sleepy. Okay? You do not thereby also feel tired and sleepy. You might not become tired and sleepy just by seeing me yawn, although yawn tends to be quite contagious. When one person yawns, everybody else goes yawning again. But this is more, this observation also happens when we express displeasure with something. Like if I kick the table by accident, I hurt my foot, and I say, shh. This is an expressive act. I'm expressing pain, or that I'm injured in some way. And now you have learned that I hurt my foot. You have not, therefore, also come to feel the same way. And this is a problem that continues to exist across a range of areas and domains where people want to defend some kind of expressivism. So expressivism in metaethics has had many objections that are similar to this. So if you think that by saying that lying is wrong, what you are doing is expressing your disapproval of lying, that is a problem because I now know that you disapprove of lying. Great. Will I not lie because you disapprove of lying? If I don't care what you think then or feel, then I might continue to lie. This is a problem because we want to think that if you, as my audience, accept what I say when I say that lying is wrong, I want you to also think that lying is wrong. And if I disapprove of it, I want you to also disapprove of it. But as we all know, there are many problems for expressivists in explaining how it is that you can communicate moral value by merely explaining your attitudes that are not successful with respect to certain things that you are evaluating morally. And the same applies to anger. So if you're expressing your anger, what I'll be doing is registering that you are angry. Why should I also come to feel the same way or appreciate in the same way what you are angry about? And in fact, this is something that some people work in moral psychology and in the philosophy of emotions have also noted with respect to what is achieved and how one communicates certain particular negative emotions or reactive emotions. So let me see if I come to the page around. Yes, I found it. So Laputa, for instance, had said that, so he was aware of this, that perhaps there's a problem in how you express anger because you might be antagonizing people rather than getting to support you, and perhaps it would be better if you were to communicate your emotions only to people who somehow are already your friends or empathize with you or identify in the same way that you do. But that is not exactly what they seem he and Srinivasan and Silva and Shoemaker want to be aiming at. They want to aim that by expressing our anger publicly, we are getting other people to be in a position to recognize the wrongs in the world or the injustices that we think are there, right? But if we're saying that only those who already feel the way we do or empathize with us will recognize our anger or recognize the way that we're appraising things, this is not a very good way to achieve any good change, let's say, in an open democratic society in which plurality of opinions and feelings exists. We want people who don't exactly think like us to come to recognize wrongs where they exist, and not just the people who like me or like us. So that's one problem. And indeed, Liput kind of recognizes this by talking about emotional contagion. So, for instance, he says, conveying one's anger to one's listeners helps them imaginatively undergo a distinctive qualitative experience. More specifically, the audience's perspective taking or empathy is rendered more complete by emotional contagion. As the audience tries to adopt the speaker's perspective, their imaginative reconstruction, altered by the anger they have infectiously gained from anger. So you, by hearing the speaker, we somehow empathize and come to be altered in the same way um, as the speaker who is angry. Now, several people work on psychology of emotions have pointed out that indeed shared emotions are important. They're important for group cohesion and in group cohesion and relationships and social relations. They can function as coordination smoothers. They can serve to motivate and justify reasons for joint action. Nonetheless, the idea, the suggestion that emotional contagion can explain how we express anger is more likely to happen between members of an in-group of people who already feel alike with respect to a particular kind of subject or subject matter, or with respect to each other. In fact, two authors, one of them is works in social psychology, and the other is a philosopher of emotions, Nico Salmela and Christian von Schief. They argue that attributions of responsibility and blame that are based on in-group versus out-group distinctions tend to lead to resentment and emotional distancing rather than emotional contagion. So what does that mean? And in fact, they write this in a paper that they have, a recent paper of theirs, on the emotional roots of right-wing political extremism. When is it that people become alienated, feel alienated in a particular social group? They might be motivated to join identities that perhaps they wouldn't have otherwise joined. And this happens not just because there are external factors like economic crisis, but because for some reason they are made to feel they're blamed or made to feel responsible for certain wrongs or associated with certain wrongs. So, as Salmela and von Schief argue, they say that these attributions are likely to lead to resentment and emotional distancing rather than emotional contagion. Their work, indeed, they say that emotional processes that affect people's identities provide additional explanation for current popularity of new radical right movements around Europe, which was their concern, not only among low and medium skilled workers, but also among middle classes whose insecurities manifest as fears of not being able to live up to salient social identities. So they have further considerations about how these things, about the particular kinds of emotions that are at play here. So what I'm saying in this case is that even if it were true that people might be angry at particular wrongs and injustices that they have suffered, their expression in an open liberal society where there's a plurality of views might have exactly the opposite effects that one wants and that some authors have been claiming this expression of anger to achieve. They might indeed be alienating and creating a further emotional distance from other people who feel threatened or feel shamed for some reasons. So I think I skipped the part of the paper where I sort of went to the direct assumption as to whether it is involved at injustice or morality. And this had to do with the brief mention that I did about how some authors like David Shoemaker consider that, well, not all anger is a response to blame, to moral blame or to moral wrongs, or is an attribution of moral responsibility to others. Some of it is just a response to goals, a response to frustrated goals or frustrated aims or desires. Now, anger, like other emotional states, are the 5 or 6 basic emotions, which include fear and anger, surprise, and I'm not going to remember all of them now. They are not just shared with human infants, but other primates and other mammals are capable of having the same kinds of emotions. So whatever those emotions are and how they have evolved as cognitive ways of responding, in particular in social animals like us, those emotions have served particular kinds of purposes, and I honestly don't believe that those purposes include social justice or moral wrongs in particular. And in fact, I think that these particular kinds of dimensions about which one might be angry, they might be different contents, different intentional contents of anger, but it doesn't mean that the emotion itself is apt or fitting only in response to, say, moral wrongs. In fact, I think that the more general consideration that anger is a response that is apt or that is elicited when one has one's frustration, one's interests or goals, or the goals of those that we care about or those we empathize with, obstructed, or when we are hurt or those we care about are hurt. That's a better explanation, I think, as what the kind of reasons that one might have to be angry in an apt or fitting way. Okay, yeah, I'm nearly done. So let's get this bit as well. So we could say that I think that it's much more correct to say that anger is an appraisal of events or actions or people that frustrate a variety of goals and interests that we may have in a much more general sense. That might explain what anger is across all possible kind of people or animals that might get angry. And this might include the goal of preserving one's social status, which is necessary for social primates to achieve our own goals, given our preferences and interests. And in this sense, there might well be an essential connection between anger and retributive action. And of course, moral wrongs might be among the things that one might be rightly angry at, insofar as we care about them. But it's not essential for apt anger that it is a response to moral wrongs. Skip this bit. I'll get to the last bits. So hold on. So just as a list of reasons. So if it's not true that anger is a response to, and when apt, to moral wrongs or injustice, and if we have not shown that successfully, I think that others have not shown that anger does not involve retributive desires or desires to retribute in some way other people's conduct, then I think that we should continue to take, we cannot not take all things considered reasons more generally into account before considering whether anger should be openly expressed or not. So we might still prefer to take into account prudential considerations against the expression of anger. There are a lot of research on who gets more angry, for instance. So there's work that shows that people who have higher social status, for instance in Japan, people who objective higher social status express anger more often than people who don't. So high social status tends to come with more ease of expressing anger. Anger plays a role in intergroup violence. With narcissistic entitlement, it's correlated with aggressiveness. With contempt and disgust, it correlates with violent action. Acting out of anger leads to conflict escalation, and this list is not exhaustive, but it's all based on research, varied research on violence and violent group actions, where you see that anger is plays an essential role there. So I think that we should indeed take into account prudential reasons against anger's expression. I'm not going to do the hatred section because that's too much. I'm going to skip that and go closer to the end. The hatred section I'll just mention very briefly before I finish. Some people who have, some researchers in social psychology interested in understanding what hatred is, came up with one hypothesis and how, in particular, in what circumstances does hatred correlate with mass violence and violent action. They have argued, through experiments and theoretical considerations, they think that hatred is in fact a combination of various more basic emotions, including disgust and anger and contempt. And it's this combination that might lead people not just to have the drive for aggression, but also desires for the elimination or exclusion of the other because of the discussed interfering here. And indeed, this is manifest in a range of historical situations in which we might even think that perhaps hatred, for instance, hatred of Nazis might be justified, but there were some pretty bad horrors, mass horrors committed against the Germans after the World War II. For instance, the mass rape of women in Berlin in 1945, under the occupation of all the Allied and the Soviet armies. And we wouldn't say that there were no reasons to hate the Nazis, because obviously there were. We wouldn't say that there were no reasons to be angry with the Nazi atrocities, which of course there were. But at the heart of hatred and at the heart of anger, the desire for retribution was what led to new horrors and new crimes. I'll conclude just with a slight agreement with some considerations by Agnes Callard, not so recent, a couple of years ago. She actually argued that yes, it would be rational to remain angry forever. We'd say if your family suffered under the Nazis, you could be angry forever against the Germans who were responsible for those atrocities. But at the heart of anger, let's say, we can't pretend that what is at the heart of anger is not bad itself. She concludes that we can't be good in a bad world. And given these considerations, I think that prudential and counterproductivity reasons do trump intrinsic aptness reasons to be angry. And I think I'll finish.
Thank you very much.